So look, Steve, thank you very much for introducing. And to you and also Susan, who's not here, thanks for the opportunity to present. The Leeward Islands is a huge philatelic subject. So by necessity, you're only going to get a small partial view of some things. Now, as a general rule, I will mix general history with postal history, and this is no exception to that. What I want to try to do is to go through some aspects of the way that the politics around the Leeward Islands, the federal part of it and the presidential part of it interacted and affected what stamps were issued, how they were issued, when they were issued, and how they were used. If I go just on scope, this picks up a little bit from James's presentation, but you've got a very a changing group of semi-independent colonies in the West Indies. It's both a geographic concept and an administrative concept. The administrative started back in the 17th century and was really formed in the way that we know it as philatelists in 1833. At that point, the federation was put together, and it was intended, most of all, I think, to save the British government or the British Empire money. And I think money is something that we shouldn't forget as we go through the subject as a whole. To be clear, when I talk about the federal, it'll be the colony of the Leeward Islands. When I talk about the presidency, it'll be the individual islands. Those islands were throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries semi-independent, fiercely protective of their own sovereignty, so somewhat reluctant members of a larger colony. If you want to know just how violent that could become, those of you who've got the inclination, go and read about Governor Park. Governor Park was based in Antigua in the early 1700s. He was so detested as governor of the Leeward Islands by his colonists that they murdered him. And I think he's the only example of a British governor lynched by his constituents. The scope today in terms of islands, it's Antigua, Montserrat, St. Kitts, Nevis, and the Virgin Islands, plus for most of it, Dominica. Dominica started out as part of the Leewards and then moved to the Windward Islands in 1939. I will say one or two words about Anguilla and Barbuda. I don't intend to cover Redonda, which is, I guess, the other one, which is geographically at least part of the Leewards. I'm going to focus on the history of the Leeward Islands as opposed to that of each presidency. I think that was done well by James in the last webcast. As I said, I want to highlight the overlaps between the federal and the presidential issues, and I'll try to illustrate for each phase some unusual or complex aspects. In terms of complexity, I'm tempted to leave this up for the next 3/4 of an hour. It's Yarry's description of the postal arrangements on the Leeward Islands from 1623, when St. Kitts was discovered, to 1958. It goes through in between the packet services in the 18th and 19th centuries, the post offices from about 1840, the GB used abroad, 1858, 1860, the federal stamps from 1891, and the concurrent use of federal and presidential stamps in most of the 20th century. This will go up later on, so I'm going to move on now. I think the only conclusion I have is what a disorganized state the British Empire left it in over about a 350-year period. There are very few specific Leeward Islands postal instruments. Hopefully someone on the call will prove me wrong, but for the moment, I think this is the only one that I've been able to find, and it's an arrival stamp used on packet services in Falmouth from about 1810 to 1840. Early on, it was dated. Later on, it was undated. So if I move to the next page, this is a dated example. This is from the Codrington correspondence, so I think it's possibly from Barbuda. It was sent on the 7th of August on a packet in 1820 and arrived about a month later in Falmouth, where it received that stamp in the top right. Struck in green, date, month, day, year in 2 lines, and the F for Falmouth at the bottom. In its later life, as you can see at the bottom left here, it lost its date. It was still used as a dumb arrival stamp. And I think there was an article in one of the predecessor journals showing that it was also used for Jamaica incomings as well. And this is an 1838 entire from St. Kitts into Mrs. Teed in Kensington. A couple of other things to note. Top right hand, there's a Hounslow Penny Post hand stamp in black, and then the St. Kitts date stamp on the left. I think, based on what I know today, I think this is probably the earliest known date of that. One caveat I should throw out before I go on, my particular interest in the West Indies is around St. Kitts. I've tried not to overemphasize Kitts in the material I'll present. If I didn't succeed in that, I apologize, but there's I hope, a fair balance. As I said, that's the only specific Leeward postal councillor that I can find, and it died out in about 1840. Before looking at what happened from about mid-1860s onwards, I just wanted to spend a moment talking about what drove postal activity in the Leewards. And I've identified 5 things which crop up on a large amount of the surviving record. So bureaucracy. There's a lot of mail that goes between the presidencies and the colony, between the presidencies and London. Physical proximity. These islands are, on occasions, only a few miles from each other, and that created curated trading links from very early times. Trading arrangements, though, shifted, and in particular in the 20th century, you see the US become the dominant partner for the federal colony, and that created quite a significant flow of mail, which I think is useful to us. And then 2 other things: religion, not just Church of England, but Reformist, Methodist, Wesleyan, Moravian. And lastly, the fact that the shipping routes used some of the islands as hubs, but were by no means tied to the Leewards or to the colony. That's 5 forces. I guess you could name a 6th, which is personal and family mail. The only issue with that is that it is significantly underrepresented in the surviving record. And then last, of course, what is, let's say, overrepresented in the surviving record is philatelic mail. So focusing on those 5, I just want to give a couple of examples of each. So this is a large official cover sent from St. Kitts to Barbados, sent on the 10th of March, 1889. It was sold in the Brooks auction at Spink in 2019. It is remarkable in being the highest franking that we have from St. Kitts over that period. It's franked at 11 shillings, and the rate for the equivalent mail at that time would have been 4p. It's an OHMS envelope. And although the president, which might have been the president on St. Kitts, it might have been the president on Antigua, is crossed out, it's sent to the Royal Engineers on Barbados. And at the bottom left, you've got an unusual cachet. You've got the Colonial Secretary, Leeward Islands stamp at the bottom left, and the initials either of the secretary or of the secretary's secretary, 9th of March, 89. Bureaucratic envelopes are interesting, generally because of the size of the franking, and because of what they tell you about the sender. This is a similar one, but much later, and it's unstamped. This is from 1942. I think probably sent locally within St. Kitts. And at the bottom left, I pulled this one out because of that cachet, that hand stamp at bottom left, in violet, from the Education Department of the Leeward Islands. Cachets like that of official entities of the federal colony are, I think, quite difficult, quite rare to find on cover. They clearly existed. They were clearly not often used. This one, as you can see, is initialed. And this one dates from 22nd May, 1942. I think it's local because it's not censored. And an even later one, this is from 57. This is from St. Kitts to Antigua, and I think it's probably from one policeman to another. At the bottom left, again, you can see a very distorted, what looks like a rubber circular date stamp from the Leeward Islands Police Administration. The date here is important. The federal colony was dissolved in 1956 with the British Caribbean Federation Act. That dissolution took 2 years to come into force with the British West Indies Federation in 1958. Federal stamps were withdrawn in 1956. We'll come back to that. So this is an unstamped cover with an official Leeward Islands cachet on the left, dating from that intermediate period between dissolution and the BWI Federation coming into existence. Quickly on inter-island mail, as I said, I think it's much underestimated, much under-recorded in the surviving record. This one is not within the empire. This is from Dominica to Martinique. It's ex-Booth, possibly ex-Brooks as well, I think. It's franked at 2.5 pence. That was the standard rate at that time. This is 1898, through to any foreign country, the USA, and Martinique, even though it wasn't very far away, is clearly part of France at that time. The 2.5 pence rate, I think most of you know, is an interesting one from the West Indies because it was used for a number of different reasons. In this case, it's for the foreign rate in the latter part of the 1890s. The one after is an earlier one. This is from 1883. I put this up because just for curiosity, at that point, the 2.5D rate was proving difficult to find stamps for. As some of you may know, there were trisected, bisected stamps used at that time. Some of them are philatelic. If you see the names Lauder, Pierce, Churchill, for example, they're generally philatelic in origin. Some of them are not. This one could be either. It's got a 1/3 of a Montserrat 60 and a 1/12 of a Montserrat 60 to make up the 2.5. There's a couple of around this time coming in from Montserrat to St. Kitts. As I say, I think some of them are really commercial, some of them perhaps not. Trade. So I mentioned earlier on, I think trade, the evolution of trade in the 19th century towards the US is a major factor in the social and independence evolution of the Leeward Islands. When, for example, the British West Indies Federation broke up, the British Virgin Islands at that point refused to, when it was formed, they refused to join because they preferred to be closer to the US. US trade by the 1920s, 1930s was the predominant part of a lot of the island's economy in the Leewards. Montgomery Ward is useful because it's generally for each island a consistent record from 1900, 1910. So you can see the evolution of postal rates, of postal markings, when registration came in, all the things like that, which are useful, I think, to us in terms of study. I picked this cover. It's not particularly exciting. It's a pre-printed Monty Ward cover from 1924. I picked it because if you look at the name of the province on the left, you've got Leeward Isles. Again, it's quite rare if you look at similar covers to this. It's quite rare to find officially the Leeward Islands being put forward as part of the address. And I think that just reflects the reluctance of the individuals on the presidencies to recognize that they were anything other than Kittitian or Antiguan or Montserratian or whatever. Quick word on religion. First thing to say is that the perimeter of the bishopric of Barbados was not the same as the colony. That changed in 1841 when the bishopric of Antigua took over. And from that, the Church of England perimeter and the federal colony perimeter are much better aligned. You've got a good record of mail, not all of the entires or not all of the contents, but a good record of mail because most of the rectors needed to report upwards to their bishop possibly once a month, possibly 1 of 2 months, but you do have quite a frequent record. This is another St. Kitts cover. Apologies for that. It's dated 8th July 1885. It's from a village on St. Kitts. I don't know which one yet. You can see the 1 penny stamp on the left. That paid the postage from the village to Basse-Terre and St. Kitts, and then the 4 penny stamp at top right, which paid the on passage from Basse-Terre to Ealing. At the time, the reformist churches were probably more important on the islands than the Church of England. And actually, if you go to some of the islands today, it's still the case. The reformist churches obviously did not consider the federal colony boundaries as important. They were set up across the other islands on the West Indies. And so there is correspondence from the Leeward Islands to those reformist churches. This is an incoming postcard to the Reverend Bartels at the Moravian Mission at Bethesda on St. Kitts. It's a Danish 3 cent. The date's 3rd December 1890. It went via St. Thomas and arrived in St. Kitts and then was delivered to the Moravian Mission. Bethesda's at a village called Cayon on St. Kitts, and in fact was and still is. You can still find it there. I put this up because there is correspondence. I've got bits of correspondence which go from Bartels to the sender of this postcard, back again from Bartels to the Moravian Mission elsewhere in the West Indies, and also to Herrnhut in Germany, which is the main headquarters of the Moravian Church. Again, I think these reformist churches were very fond of communicating, very anxious to communicate, and there is quite a lot of to and fro mail, correspondence mail, which I think is interesting to tease out. Shipping. The first one, this is a federal 1D postcard. If you remember my first page, I put Leeward Islands, Île sous le Vent, and you've got the Île sous le Vent on the postcard. That's what the UPU required you to put. This one went from St. Kitts, it transited through Jamaica. There's both a Jamaica hand stamp and a transit hand stamp in the middle. For some reason, it then went by boat north to Boston, where it arrived on the 8th of September. There's a Boston hand stamp, and it came all the way back to Turks Islands. So it took a month and a half on ship, going north, going south, going round in circles, and eventually arrived in Turks Islands. Why did this postcard go? It was written by the postmaster at St. Kitts, Mr. Pierce, and he was trying to find some supplies of St. Kitts Queen Victoria 60 olive green. So there's a wonderful philatelic message on the back. There are some Leeward Island stamps with manuscript cancellations on shipping. This is one of those. It was carried out on the Esk. Those 3 vessels, the Eden, the Esk, and the Solent, which did a lot of work around the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries in the Leewards. You can see you've got a 1D QV stamp there on the right. And rather than being postmarked, it's cancelled in red ink, as many of them are, by the purser on board. It's upside down. It is from the Esk. And then he also applied the Per Esk and Para, which are the 2 vessels that transferred this mail, at the top left. And then lastly, on shipping routes, this is a later one. It's a Paquebot cover, again, a federal 1.5D, franked at Dominica and then sent to St. Lucia. 1938 is relatively late for Dominica. As I mentioned earlier on, it passed to the Windward Islands a year later. I'm sure that there are later examples of Leeward Island stamps on Dominica franked mail, but they must be getting pretty rare at this time. So that's 5 themes which will come back over the rest of the presentation. We get into the meat of some of the stamps. So up until 1890, there was no unified postal system across the federal colony. All of the presidencies had their own stamps. They'd all issued them between 1862 and 1876. And I think the only striking thing that I point out is how different they all are. They're different printers, They're different designs, they're different styles. In the case of Nevis and the Virgin Islands, they clearly wanted them to reflect the national identity of the island. We'll see this come back again in 1899 to 1903. The governor of the Leewards spent a couple of years at the end of the 1880s trying to rationalize what he felt was a fairly ridiculous stamp issuing situation. He sent a letter through to the Crown agents at the beginning of 1890 with a proposal to withdraw the presidential issues and issue the federal stamps. At that time, he commented that there were around 80 different stamps available across the 6 islands for use. They were withdrawn at the end of 1890, at the end of October. This is the sale notice for the remainders. They were put on sale in 1891 for both stamps and for cards. Postal stationery arrived about a month to 2 months, for most of it, after the arrival of stamps in October 1890. After that date, you do see presidential stamps on cover. I think I've seen St. Kitts one up as far as 1907. You do not see them in the same way that you see the mixed frankings later in the 20th century. They are all contrived, as far as I've been able to see, and posted for favor. So I think the withdrawal was a fairly hard stop for the presidential stamps. These, you know, this is SG1 or SC128, 8 denominations for fiscal and for postage use. These are the first stamps in the colony which were available formally from the start for both. I'm going to come back to talk about revenue a little bit later. I've got 2 or 3 pages on that, if I may. So Mail started using the federal stamps almost immediately afterwards. This is a cover I've taken from Oliver, dated 15th December 1890. It's interesting because of the franking. It's a 6D franking. It's a registered mail, so there's 2D, 2 pence for the registration and 4D for the postage. The postage throughout the 1880s up to the end of 1890 was 4 pence for most destinations. But on the 1st of January 1891, so only 2 months after the federal stamps were introduced, that rate was dropped from 4 pence to 2.5p. There are very few covers. I don't have one, and this is why I found a scan. Very few covers from that 2-month period. There was potentially a little bit of uncertainty after that 2-month period, but that 2-month period where you find 4D postage, they're quite rare and quite unusual, franked in this way. So that's why I thought that was useful and interesting to show. And then the rates changed. This is a fairly straightforward Nevis cover, dated 1895, sent to the Bankers Maynard in New York, and it's got the 2.5D franking sent on the Madiana. So from 1891 onwards, most of the US postage that you see, if it's single rate anyway, it's got the 2.5D. Stamps continued to be issued. I've got two examples. The sexagenary commemoratives in 1897. This is a philatelic piece of mail. It's from the 1 week in which those sexagenaries were issued, which was the 22nd of July to the 29th, 1897. They were very popular, but they didn't entirely sell out, and you can find later examples of them on cover. Into the early 1900s, I've seen one, for example, which must be quite unusual to find. They were available on Anguilla for a short period in 1902. As some of you may know, there are reported double and triple overprints on this. If you read Oliver's account and the other accounts of the way that these overprints were put together, they all stress the care with which the post official did the hand stamping. So double and triple overprints are very rare and much more frequently available forged. Very short period, a couple of months of provisionals in 1902 between the death of the old Queen and the arrival of the King Edward VII new definitives. There, the colony was in shortage of low-value stamps, There was an overprint done in two ways, one with big type, one with small type, 1 penny on 4p, 6p, and 7p. Not often found, I would say, commercially or properly used. The residual stocks were used a lot philatelically. This is a local cover again on one of the villages in St. Kitts. 10 of the stamps, including, even though I find it very difficult to identify it, but apparently the second stamp on the left at the top has a narrow O in it, which is one of the variants in the overprint. I'll happily leave it up for those of you who want to spy it. I can't zoom it, but given that it's underneath the date stamp, I find it quite difficult to really tell that one apart, but apparently it is. Stationery. So stationery was issued, as I said, about 1 or 2 months after the stamps. Stationery consisted of 2 types of news wrappers, half D and 1D, pre-printed envelopes, 1D and 2.5D, postcards and post-reply cards for a penny and a penny halfpenny, and 2 penny registration stamps. I've got 3 examples. I'm not going to illustrate the whole lot. This is a half D wrapper. It goes to Margate, goes on a ship, the Fontebelle, goes via New York. As you all know, wrappers are made of pretty fragile paper, so it's quite unusual to find them used. I think they didn't really last a long journey. Then a 2.5D envelope. A couple of comments to make. First, they followed the British trend at the time of making embossed prints. So the 2.5p on the right, at the top right's embossed. That's a change from the way that pre-printed postcards were done before the introduction of federal stationery. This 2.5p should have been enough to take this envelope to St. Thomas, which, as you can see, was the final destination. 12th February 1892. However, I think probably because it was intended to be delivered to a ship, the Moltke, which was anchored at St. Thomas at the time, it was considered on arrival from Dominica to St. Thomas to be underflanked, hence the T and hence the 15C in blue crayon at the top. And I reckon that 15C took it from the curb, from the quayside to the ship. And then lastly, a registered envelope. Compared to the presidential stationery, these are different in that the registration amount is embossed again, but it's embossed on the back. So it's on the flap, the 2p at the bottom left, that little image there. This again is from Dominica to Barbados. It's a 4D franking, 2D for the registration, and a double rate postage. Dated 1902, so again, just before the introduction of King Edward VII. So a wide range of postal stationery, and we'll come back to when that got taken out of circulation a little bit later. 1899, so it should read The Empire Strikes Back, but actually it's the presidencies that strike back from 1899. They start to issue their own stamps, the Virgin Islands in 1899, and the rest of the presidencies in about 1902, 1903. Why did they do it? Probably through loss of money. It isn't clear, but it looks likely that the federal colony was using its control over the ordering of postage stamps and their distribution to control more of the cash flow between the different islands, and the presidencies 9 years, 8-9 years after the federal introduction revolted against this. You have the same trend that you saw in the 1862 to 1867. So the Virgin Islands, they went first in 1899. They used the key and duty plate system from De La Rue, exactly the same format and design as the federal stamps. But Dominica used a view of the island, Antigua used the badge, and St. Kitts and Nevis, who joined together at this point, used 2 images. One is the iconic medicinal spring from Nevis, which was on their 1862 stamps, and the other one is the completely anachronistic telescope and Columbus, which for some reason St. Kitts decided to adopt. And from this period on, you've got mixed frankings. So I've got a few examples of mixed frankings. Again, None of these are particularly scarce, none of these are particularly rare, but hopefully they will just illustrate the different types of mixed frankings you get. This is a Virgin Islands cover to the postmaster at Nassau. The 4D franking made up of the Leeward Islands half-Ds at the top and the Virgin Islands war stamps at the bottom left. The 2 half-Ds pay the postage, if you like. The 2 1Ds pay the registration. And the third 1D pays the war stamp tax that was in force in 1917 when this cover was sent. And I think I'm right to say that in the Virgin Islands, that war stamp tax was a penny, not a halfpenny as it was elsewhere. This is an official envelope sent from Government House on the Virgin Islands. And in a similar vein, this is a 1D postcard, King Edward VII, so relatively late use in 1917 again of that postcard, from Antigua to London. The 1D was sufficient to get it there, but it was taxed at the time, the additional halfpenny war stamp, and again, that was put on to pay that extra tax. It's worth noting at this point that the federal government didn't issue the overprints for either war tax or war stamp. And that's one of the explanations as to why you have the mixed franking here. This is philatelic, Montserrat to Germany. But although philatelic to Kidderlin in Ulm, it passed through the mail. For example, it's got the arrival stamp on the back. And I think it's correctly franked. That 6D should pay a 2D registration, 2.5D for the first ounce, 1.5 for the second ounce. Kidderlin often has very colorful frankings, as you see here, but more often than not, they seem to be franked about right. Quick one from St. Kitts. This is an early one, 10th of October 1905, registered letter. It's a St. Kitts registered envelope with Leeward Islands stamps. It's got 6 of the new 2.5Ds. This is the first printing of those stamps. It's 15 pence, 6 times the standard rate for the time. I just wanted to point out the fragment of wax, and there's an image down on the bottom left. Stamps were issued a lot of the post office in the early 1900s. Good strikes are hard to find. They weren't issued again in Leeward Islands form, as far as I know, but they did serve yet again to illustrate the separation between the presidencies and their postal arrangements and the federal authorities. This one's from Nevis, a little bit more wax. It's a commercial cover to Middleton, sorry. It's a late usage. Again, I think not much else to say other than that. Actually, one comment I was going to make here. It's quite unusual to find federal registered letters, pre-registered letters on either St. Kitts or Nevis. They seem to use just their own, at least up until about 1919, 1920. And that mirrors St. Kitts' general practice. For example, they didn't order high-value stamps over $1 between 1903 and 1918 from the federal authorities. They used their own. I'm going to finish with what is one of my favorite covers from Anguilla, which is, as some of you know, is close to my heart. There are a number of things that I like about this. First, it's a mixed franking. The block of 4 half-Ds in the middle pay the registration. The war stamp on the right pays the postage. It's got the Anguilla, the AN canceller, the duplex canceller, covering all 3 stamps. It's a nice cover through to Montgomery Ward. There are a lot of those. And the thing I like most is the hand-drawn R in oval at the top right. This is when registration on Anguilla was at its infancy. It's worth me just saying, going back to one of my themes, we've got 9 covers extant on Anguilla between 1900 and 1920. 5 of those are to Montgomery Ward. 3 of them are religious. and one of them is from the local vicar complaining about his quality of life. This brings us up to about 1927, 1928, and there's a point of conflict at this time. First, it's important to note that the post office services had expanded. I've given you the notice of 1939. The only difference there is that there were more sub-post offices on Anguilla, but they'd shut relatively quickly. But I think the most interesting part that Oliver pointed out, and then I'll pick up on, is the statement on the right. So existing stocks of presidential, I need to read it here, existing stocks of various presidential denominations which duplicate those of the federal issue are to be abolished, which is a pretty categorical statement that you need to stop using presidential stamps and use only federal. Goes on to say, except that existing stocks may continue to be used until exhausted, which makes some sense. If you've got outstanding presidential stamps, use them to the end. But the killer phrase is, or otherwise ordered. So that drives a coach and horses through any attempt, and there clearly was attempt at this time by the federal authorities to limit the postage stamps to Leeward Islands only. Clearly with that phrase, it didn't work, and you continue to get both used in mixed frankings side by side until 1956. Slightly different story for postal stationery. Presidential postal stationery was phased out in 1928. So you can see with the expansion that came in the 20s, came some additional conflict. I'm not going to say much more about Anguilla. It started to receive stamps from 1900. Initially, it received the federal stamps, and you can see at bottom left, there's a Queen Victoria half-D, cancelled 1901 on Anguilla. It also received federal postal stationery. In the middle, there's one of those Wesleyan Methodist covers that I mentioned on a 1 penny King Edward VII postage envelope. But between 1903 and about 1919, 1920, as far as the surviving record tells us, no federal stamps were available. Postal stationery, yes, but stamps, no on Anguilla. Only St. Kitts and Nevis stamps were available. Barbuda legally is unusual. It was a private island leased by the Codrington family from the Crown and run as a private estate. There's a lot of correspondence from Barbuda up to the change of status in 1896 when it was transferred to Antigua. A lot of those things are estate correspondence. This is one example I've taken from our display from Dennis Reynolds, and this one was dated 1784. 1922, Barbuda wanted to issue its own stamps. They took the federal stamps, they overprinted them in black and in red. They're known in specimen form. Some of you may have seen them. They're known also in proof form. But they quickly got exhausted, and by 1925, Barbuda was back using just the federal stamps. And this is a 1927 example, quite high franking, 2 shilling stamp, federal stamp on the right. And then the new Barbuda registration box at the bottom left. That was introduced in 26, about a year before this cover was sent. One or two other subjects. Revenues. Revenues mirror what happened to postage stamps. We've got to remember that behind every revenue stamp is money and is income. And stamp duty on imports, exports, and on transactions was the main independent source of both federal and presidential revenue. The federal colony took the initiative in 1881 to issue high-value revenue stamps. You've got 4 examples here, from 60 up to £1. And you've got one cancelled Antigua, cancelled Dominica, cancelled Nevis, and then the bottom one cancelled the Virgin Islands. And these were the standard way of evidencing high-value transactions throughout the 1870s and 1890s. You see some of the presidencies trying to overprint their stamps or use their postage stamps for revenue purposes, but they're low value. So any high value transaction was driven towards the use of the Leeward Islands fee stamps. They were often used in conjunction with the postage revenue stamps. This is a deed from Anguilla dated 1902. You've got 3 federal Queen Victoria stamps at the top left, 2 1 shillings and a 60, and then 2 fee stamps at the bottom right, a 6pence and a 1 shilling. And those fee stamps continue to be used, as you've seen from the previous page, through King Edward VII and King George V, but not for low value transactions. This is just a customs docket, a very standard customs docket. Antigua, 12th June 1891, for sugar sent from Antigua to the Delaware breakwater. This sort of customs docket is franked at 1p, and you've got the Leeward Islands QV stamp at the bottom left, which is initialed. And you find postage stamps from the presidencies fulfilling this role, as well as the federal stamps, all of them initialed in the same way. And I did find a mixed franking. I wanted to find a mix of Leeward and presidential stamps. This is one that I found. I apologize. It's an incredibly battered bill of exchange from the Quaker Oats Company to Garraway, the merchants on Dominica. It attracts duty of 6p, 2 of them, or 5p paid by those 2 Dominica 2.5p's on the right, and the additional 1p paid by the federal 1d at the top. You can see a host of colonial bank stamps, both from New York and from Dominica. So as I've said, I think revenue is a good example again of money as a driving factor about how the federal colony and the presidencies issued the stamps, whether for postal use or for revenue use. Word on stamp design, just 2 pages on this. I think there's nothing much to say on this page other than that it is startling how during a period of creativity in stamp design up to 1956, the federal stamps remained identical. If you were to think about the way that Antigua definitives or Montserrat definitives changed over that time, this is remarkably cold, unemotional stamp design. The £1 and 10 shillings are slightly different, and you can see the QE2s were the first which introduced the new currency, which came to force in 1951. There was one variance to that, or one potential variance to that, and that was potentially around King Edward VIII. There were new stamp designs developed, except in the UK, not put into production. You've got 2 illustrations here. One is the proof of the way the Leeward Islands would appear on the stamp. And then at the bottom right, you've got a scan of a stamp that was actually printed, a 1D stamp showing how the King's Head would have appeared. They were requisitioned. They were printed on 5th of December 1936. And having been printed, they were then destroyed with the abdication. You can find proofs from some of the presidencies. I know them from St. Kitts, and you can also find specimens from Grenada. Last word is on requisitions. I think it's important to remember that not all stamps, not all federal stamps were ordered and issued to all of the presidencies. Requisition 972 is an example of that. It was for 5 stamps, 4, 5, 2 shilling, 3 shilling, 4 shilling, for St. Kitts. The order for the 2 shillings was for 1,038 sheets. The label you have on the page is the label which sent those stamps through to St. Kitts. And as you can see, only 340 sheets were actually delivered. I think it was Simon Goldblatt in one of the journal articles who said it would be an interesting task for someone to try to collect every federal stamp issued to every village in every presidency across the period from 1891 to 1956. It's a complex task. Good luck to any of those of you who've tried it. So we're going to come to the end here. Commemoratives, currency changes, withdrawal and replacement. I'm not going to spend too much time, but the commemoratives that came out during the latter part of King George V, King George VI, and into Queen Elizabeth. So these are the Jubilee in 1935, as well as being issued in presidential form, were also issued in Leeward Islands form. And this is a cover philatelic with the 4 issues from Antigua through to Colorado. More interestingly, maybe when you get to 1951, you get a change of currency. So on this cover, it's not a particularly inspiring cover to Jamaica from St. Kitts, but you've got a Leeward Islands, British West Indies University commemorative, the 3 cent at the top right. They were the first stamps issued in the colony using the Caribbean dollar as currency in 1951. And it's a mixed franking with a St. Kitts 1D. So you have a double mix, the currency is mixed, and also the issuer is mixed. And the next page is a more flagrant example of that. In the middle, you've got 2 Leeward Islands 3 cent QE2 commemoratives. At the right, you've got a single QE2 St. Kitts 2 cent, and then the franking, I think, to make the correct 10 pence NL rate. The complement is made up by a 6D stamp from the federal King George VI definitives. So I think that's triple mix. QE2 stamps came out only 2 years before withdrawal. Not much to say about that. This one was a philatelic cover issued to Butler in Toronto in March 1956, and at the end of June, the stamps were withdrawn, as we heard earlier, as the colony was dissolved. Now, that doesn't mean to say that things then got easier in terms of politics. So just 2 or 3 last pages. One, you can continue to chart from the individual presidencies from 1958 onwards, their moves towards independence. The British West Indies Federation was put together by the British government with the objective of having the West Indies Islands gain independence as a bloc. You had an omnibus issue across a number of countries in 1958. Relatively quickly, the federation fell apart as one by one the islands felt that they were better off independent. The independence process started in the 60s, finished in the 70s, and you've got stamps to commemorate each of those. This is statehood for St. Kitts in 1967. Statehood was independence for all, probably except foreign policy matters. I started out by talking about the semi-independence of the islands, about the often fraught relationship with the Leeward Islands governor. I mentioned Governor Park earlier on. None of that disappeared. It might have changed in nature, but the independence process was a very conflictual one. Not only conflictual, obviously, with the British government, but also conflictual between the states themselves. Rivalry led to the dissolution of the federation, and statehood led to the revolution on Anguilla, as some of you may know or may have read. Statehood was what triggered it. The stamps here are the last example that I have in this presentation of conflict between an island and its independence, its wish for self-governance, and a larger entity, whether it be St. Kitts in this case, the federal government or the British government, standing in the way of that. And that conflict evidenced through stamps. So I'm going to close and say thank you very much. A few conclusions. We need to remember that the federal colony of the Leeward Islands was partly a security, but most of all an economic venture by the British government. It was a relatively easy solution from London to group together a bunch of West Indian islands. With that came an attempt to make the postal services operate on a unified basis. But the concurrent existence of the presidency stamps throughout the 150 years up to independence shows the tensions in that idea. And I thought I'd end on a slightly weird postcard. This is incoming from Germany in 1906. And the reason why I chose it is because it's, again, one of the very few postal items that I can find that uses the Leeward Islands as a concept in the address. There are some, they're out there, but they're nowhere near as common as mail where it's not used. Wohnen, I think, unless my German is lost, I think it actually means apartment rather than colony. But the sender here thought that it was important to mention that St. Christopher was in the Leeward Islands. As it was, his postcard was not picked up and spent a year coming into St. Kitts and going back again. That's it from me. I'm probably over time. I apologize. We did start late. I've left you some further reading on the back page. Philately is my main sources for this talk on the left. I would recommend the 4 books on the right of general history. You've got a Caribbean history, which is a really excellent read for all of the Caribbean and its general history. A book around 5 of the Leewards, covering most of the 19th century. You want to focus on life on St. Kitts, the handbook from Catherine Burden is an excellent guide, including to the Postal Service. And lastly, I would really recommend, if you want to understand why people were so independent-minded, Island by Island, Settler Society by Natalie Zaczek is a super book to explain who came to the Leewards, why they came, what they came to find, why they were frustrated, angry, or occasionally happy once they got there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Very educational. I've learned a lot from that, and it's all very complicated. Can you tell me what the UPU's attitude was to all this chopping and changing? Did they recognise the islands individually or as a group of all the Leewards?
So the main entity interacting with the UPU was the federal colony. The transmission of UPU regulations into each of the individual presidencies was a mess. So if you look at 1879, you can find short periods, for example, before and around that, where the wrong frankings are used, where the 60 rate, for example, which was pre-UPU, is hung over and used, or where the under 300 miles rate, which was the 2.5p rate at that time, was not used. And you find the same thing in 1891, or in 1891, with the reduction of the rate from 4p to 2.5. Again, the instructions that came from the UK, from the UPU, through the federal authorities were far from clear, and you do have some correspondence that you can find between the individual postmasters and London to seek clarification on that. I would sum up by saying the federal authorities reckoned that they were in charge, but the way that they were in charge was somewhat chaotic.
Like herding cats, by the sound of it.
In both directions.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Anybody else got any questions for Julian? Don't forget to unmute yourself before you ask the question.
I haven't got a question. I'd just like to say thank you, Julian. And my computer decided to shut down, I think, on your second to last screenshot, which I was very disappointed about. But I'll catch up again later. But it was very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, excellent, Julian. I particularly liked your was it Antigua Trisect and the other one on there. That's very unusual.
The trisects are pretty controversial. So I've got one from mid 1884, which has got an RPSL certificate to a guy called Porter. But I've got other incomings to Porter, which imply that he was just receiving things philatelically. The addressing on the cover I showed, I've not managed to track down and not seen anywhere else. I would actually tend to believe that was probably incoming and commercial. There's another one incoming from Montserrat, which is definitely to an estate owner on St. Kitts. So there's a lot of controversy around them, and I tend to look to the author to give a guide on whether they're commercial or just part of the philatelic activity at that time, which was very strong, by the way. I think it's difficult to underestimate the amount of money, for example, that Pierce on St. Kitts was making from philately as a sideline. It was clearly a significant contribution to his income.
Mm-hmm.
Your one looks very good compared with if you look at the latest Grosvenor catalogue in the Montserrat section. There's one there where the cancellation looks extremely, shall we say, dodgy.
The cancellations on that one are quite pristine. It's a good Montserrat paid strike, and it's a good St. Kitts strike. I've seen other ones which have got a very, very blurred, and I haven't seen the Grosvenor. I'll go and look at that.
Yeah, it's the wrong size, I think, the cancellation.
Okay.
More circular than oval.